Good evening, and welcome to Leveraging Your Study Abroad Experience, the Value of Study Abroad, and How It Can Help You in the Job Search. We planned this event for a beautiful spring day at the end of March, so thank you for coming tonight on what turned out to be a cold and snowy winter day at the end of March instead. My name is Reed Click, and I am the Faculty Director of the GW Center for International Business Education and Research, or GW-CIBER. The GW-CIBER is one of 33 centers of excellence funded by the U.S. Department of Education to support international business education through a wide variety of student programming, faculty research, and outreach to the American business community. We are particularly interested in advancing global experiential learning, both through traditional study abroad exchange programs, as well as consulting practicum opportunities abroad. CIBER is sponsoring tonight's event along with two co-sponsors, the GW Office for Study Abroad and the GW School of Business Office of Global and Experiential Education. Tonight we're pleased to have a panel of current and former students and professionals from area businesses and organizations. They come from a wide variety of backgrounds, and there is a handout that contains the speaker biographies. We are also pleased to welcome back to GW our keynote speaker and moderator, international careers expert Stacie Berdan. GW-CIBER has worked with Ms. Berdan on previous occasions in events that have turned out to have long-lasting value. I am not sure that Ms. Berdan knows this, but one current MBA student told me that she chose to come to the GW School of Business specifically because of an event last year featuring Ms. Berdan on the topic of women in international business, why organizations need to invest more in women. And so thank you very much for that. She's doing good whether she knows it or not. Stacie Berdan is an international careers expert and award-winning author. She has worked in more than 50 countries and continues to counsel companies on global issues. She spends a great deal of her time speaking on college campuses, where her advice on global careers has been characterized as engaging, insightful, inspirational, and authentic by professionals, campus counselors, and students alike. She is the author of several books, most recently, A Student Guide to Study Abroad and Raising Global Children. You can learn more about her in the handout that contains a bigger biography, and you can read her articles and blogs at http://stacieberdan.com. But you can also listen to her right now. Please help me welcome Ms. Stacie Berdan.
Thank you very much for that. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm very happy to be here. I love to come to the campus, and it's wonderful to know that I inspired at least one young woman. And hopefully the conversation that we have tonight inspires many of you to, whether you've studied abroad already, you're thinking about it, or you're interested in an international career, how to actually leverage that study abroad experience. For those of you who have studied abroad, you're in a very select group. You know, the numbers vary, but for undergraduate students, less than 10% actually spend any time abroad during their undergraduate years. And if you take a look at the broader scope of graduate and graduate and PhD level work, it's actually down to about 1%. So whatever the exact number is, you're a small minority and a very special one. But it's really important actually that more students do study abroad, and we'll talk a little bit about that. I have to confess that although I wrote a book about study abroad, I myself did not study abroad. I also talk a lot about the importance of foreign language, and I'm sorry to say I don't speak another foreign language. But actually that makes me really, I think, a great advocate. I've spent a lot of time internationally. When I went through my undergraduate and graduate work, I worked full-time, and I never even thought about studying abroad because I didn't think it was possible. So I was one of those students who didn't even go into the office to figure out if it was going to work for me or not. So it's one of the things that I do for those who are interested, who think it's not for you. Don't do what I did. Really do yourself a favor and actually pursue it to see if you can. All of my friends were international, though. My friends were the international students, one from Morocco, two from France, one from Italy. And I spent a lot of time traveling. I spent time in their homes. But traveling abroad is not studying abroad. It is not working abroad. They are different. And so I made it a point for some time in my career that I actually would take some time and try to work abroad. And that is what actually inspired several of my books and the journey there, because it can be tough, but it's very rewarding. I actually made that jump with Burson Marsteller. It took me a long time to convince them, but I left. I lived in DC, was transferred to Hong Kong, and my time in Hong Kong actually really inspired me and made me realize how important global experience is to today, and increasingly, not only from a work perspective, but a studying perspective, volunteering abroad as well, and also, as Reed mentioned, all the way down into the K through 12 system to actually help broaden and open the minds of younger people, because it really does matter earlier on. But that inspired my first book. I worked in the corporate world for many years, both Unilever and Burson Marsteller. I worked all over the world. I had virtual teams, managed people in 25 different countries. And I attribute my success to my ability to work cross-culturally, which I think there's something inside of those of us who like that, but also that time in Hong Kong really taught me a lot about that. Since then, I've written several books, and several of you, the lucky few who got a copy of A Student Guide to Study Abroad. There's a lot in here about preparing to go abroad, cross-cultural preparation, and how to actually use your study abroad experience. We're going to touch on that tonight, but there's a lot there as well. But in order to start, I really want to set the stage, and we're going to play a video to kind of set the stage. That is the interconnected world we live in. Some people, it excites them, like me and hopefully all of you. Some, it worries us a little bit about how we're actually going to fit in and what's going to happen. But whatever you think about globalization, there's no denying it's here, now, happening, and changing the way we live every day. And students in particular, and young graduates, young professionals really need to understand how this fits into your life, because it matters. And there are so many trends that are going on in the global marketplace, things that have changed. And we really need to prepare, actually, to help prepare students and help you work, actually, in this dynamic workplace. There's the slowing growth that's occurring in the US and lots of Western markets, the rising economies around the world that are actually changing. If you take a look at a map, it changes regularly, but it really has an impact on where it is that we're looking for where the growth is, how the global supply chain is interconnected, and who works where, and how things are sourced. and the rise of the new players. It used to be when you graduated, maybe, especially in the US, you looked at the large multinationals if you were in business, or different companies and organizations, and those were mainly US or Western Europe. Now there are so many growing in China and Mexico and Turkey, throughout the Middle East, that are actually changing the way actually you need to look and search for jobs. And of course, the rising middle class has had a huge impact on that global supply chain, where products are sourced, who actually creates them, and 95% of consumers are actually outside the United States. They're actually not even here. So that's a little bit of actually what we're looking at. And when people ask me a lot, where should I study abroad? What languages should I speak? Where should I plan my career? I hesitate in giving one answer. One, I say it's what you're passionate about, because it really has to be authentic. You have to love it. You have to enjoy it. But you also have to be realistic. And so when pressed further, I would like to live in Italy, and I'd like to work there. But has anyone taken a look at the unemployment statistics? I mean, it's really not necessarily going to happen, even for someone like me who has a lot of international experience. So these maps, they're changing all the time, and it's really important to take a look at what is it that you want. So if I'm pressed, I will say, look at emerging markets, look at the developing markets. If you're thinking about studying abroad, go somewhere. Maybe it's Spanish. You don't necessarily have to go to Spain. There's all of Central and South America nearby as well. So it's really important to take a look at that, and also to follow the trends. These things change a lot. From 6 to 9 months, the maps may look very different. And you really should look at your career actually through a global lens, not just your sector and what it is you've learned and those technical skills, but your the global lens as well. But globalization obviously affects students, and I've been doing what I've been doing for about 7 years. Talking about this, advocating, and I've just begun to see just kind of a massing, which is great. It's a movement. Michelle Obama, if everyone noticed, was in China. She's been in China, and she talked about the importance of study abroad and learning languages and global citizenry. So important, right? Anyone see Nick Kristof's piece in the New York Times about a week and a half ago? He talked about his experience, and that study abroad should be part of every single undergraduate degree, which is amazing. And then the Institute of International Education, which published Student Guide to Study Abroad, just launched this great campaign, 5-year campaign called Generation Study Abroad, to try to double the number of students studying abroad. So there's a lot of great movement. A lot of the language groups are actually starting to ramp up what they're doing, hoping to actually teach foreign languages through K through 12, trying to push more of that forward. And I just met with some people at the National Geographic today who were talking about a geoeducator kind of push that they're doing. So there's a lot of push, which is great, because employers really want this. It's really important. You go through school, you study a lot, you've got a great technical toolbox, right? You learn how to do certain things, and that's really important. But employers increasingly want soft skills too. The curiosity, the relationship building, the communication skills. Those things are very, very important, and I think it's something that's missing. I speak on college campuses across the country, and it's really missing. And the easiest way to get it is through cross-cultural interaction. But that's something to think about, because employers really do want globally minded workers. I've seen this change dramatically. It used to be kind of a nice-to-have international experience, and I really believe it's changed to be a must-have, especially for all of you. And it's not just business majors. Who actually is in business? Okay, engineering, good. Anyone want to work for maybe not-for-profits or policy or government? Great. This actually applies to everybody. When people say, oh, well, I'm not into business, so this doesn't affect me. Well, if you work as a researcher in a lab, many times it could be for a big, like NIH or something like that, but it could be actually like a company like Unilever, for which I worked for many years. Even though you're a scientist, you're still working for profit. And employers are not just private sector companies and corporations listed on exchanges. They're higher education institutions, which are increasingly going global, NGOs, not-for-profits, government, and entrepreneurs as well, another great thing. So as we look at how can you get these skills, has everyone studied abroad? I want to kind of get a gauge. Raise your hand if you have studied abroad. So you're here. And anyone has not, but kind of thinking about studying abroad? Okay, great. So what we're going to talk about is how to leverage it. But it's really important to think about as you pursue what program you choose and where you go and what you plan to do, that actually you think about how that study abroad experience can play a role. Because it's not just a fun, frivolous time. Study abroad can make a difference in your life because it is life-changing, yes, but not because it's, eating 100 flavors of gelato in Italy or partying all the time because you're able to drink in places or traveling, from place to place. There is the study part in study abroad, and that's where a lot of the in-depth kind of deep learning occurs. So it's really important to actually look at it that way as well, because study abroad can have a powerful impact on your cross-cultural horizons, right? We talk about personal growth and development, how it actually really expands out, and I'd like to say kind of pumps out a few facets of your person that maybe you never would have met had you not spent time abroad. It definitely enhances your career opportunities. For the last 8 years, I have been asking employers, and this is, again, government, higher ed, not-for-profits, NGOs, private sector, all types. If you had 2 resumes in front of you that essentially look the same, it's a bit of a strange thing, but believe it or not, when you're a young graduate or a new graduate, you don't have a lot of experience, all resumes kind of do look alike to employers. I was a hiring manager for more than 10 years. Study abroad experience will be the differentiator for you. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. It also has been shown that it actually helps improve your grades. You come back more focused, and there's a real push now to try to have this gap year being kind of rebranded or called, a bridge year before you go, because what the studies have shown is that students are much more focused. Hopefully you've experienced that as well when you came back. And retention rates. You actually graduate on time, and you don't actually wait to graduate. But you do have to make the most of it because, everybody see this? All study abroad programs aren't the same. We love Tuscany. The cell reception was fantastic and the Wi-Fi was to die for. It's not about staying connected with your friends on Facebook. It's not about staying connected through music and movies and that. It's really taking the deep dive into that local cultural experience, and that is really what's necessary. Because employers don't want someone who studied abroad because you travel to all the capitals of Europe. They actually want you because you've learned to think differently. You've been in a situation that's a little scary, a little different. So that's one of the things that's most important. But you really do have to work at making connections. So why is it so important? What's the value? When I talk to employers, cross-cultural awareness, really important, especially on diverse teams. Even if you don't want to work internationally or go live and work somewhere else, you're probably going to be on virtual teams of people around the world. You might report to somebody in another country. You may have people report to you eventually in other places, in different time zones and geographies. And it's really important to be able to deal with those people. Ability to bring global thinking skills to bear on complex issues. Employers really need that diversity of thought. Language skills. Who actually speaks another language? I'm putting my hand down. Yeah, great. That's great. That's a wonderful thing, especially because here in the United States, we don't emphasize that early on. So if actually you speak another language or 2, that's great because actually you've beaten the odds. And you saw some of those statistics about bilingual Americans. It's not very common, but they're increasingly important, and especially Spanish, English, and of course Chinese and English. I've seen a lot in job searches and companies saying, do you know anybody? We're really looking for someone with these types of skills. Of course, predisposition to and experience with global mobility. You've been abroad. They can actually, if you have a passport, they can actually send you on a business trip maybe, and you're not going to freak out because you landed in an international airport. So whatever it is you do, whether it's study, internship, volunteer, it actually is appropriate, and a way you can figure out ways to actually make it relevant to your career. Cross-cultural preparedness, I want to touch on just briefly. It's really important to actually be prepared before you go, have the intervention when you're on the ground, and of course when you return, because it's really important to actually help you and work with what you've learned and be able to integrate that into your experiences. So I'm going to give you some 10 tips here before we open it up to our panel discussion. Some things to do how to leverage your study abroad. You have to recognize that you've changed, right? You have all these different types of skills. It wasn't just about fun, but you've actually grown personally, professionally, hopefully, if you've done some study and you've actually been able to maybe take a deep dive in some sector or something that you've learned. Learn to tell a good story is another way to leverage it. How many people say when someone asks you, how was your study abroad? Oh, great, it was a time of my life. Please do not say that in a job interview. It means nothing. And don't tell them about all the things you saw and all the things you did and all about you. You really need to tell a good story about what you learned, or an interesting time that you saw this, or you learned something about yourself, or stereotypes, or whatever it is. So practice that. You'll also find that when you tell people about your study abroad experience, they'll be more inclined to listen. Because if you just say that, or you give them the long laundry list and 20 minutes later, you're done speaking and they've, ho-hummed and turned away and they're not paying attention anymore. So really learn how to tell a good story. It actually helps people remember you as well. Build on your global experience. It is not over. Now that you're back, you've just begun. So really continue to keep up. Pay attention to global news. Pay attention to the country or the region you were in. Practice your language skills, of course. Network. You probably met a lot of people when you were there. You networked with other students, maybe some professors, maybe you met some people on your program. Continue to network with them, because it is a great way to continue to grow your network here, not only when you're looking for a job, because it's not only about that. It's about in the next year or 2 or 5 or 10 years to meet other like-minded people. Identify some of the lessons learned and the skills you develop. This is critical, and this folds into how you tell your stories. What was it that you learned? How did you improve in this way or that? And take a look at some of the skills that are important, like adaptability, relationship building, communication skills. Because once you're put outside your comfort zone and you're in that strange environment, you actually have a lot to learn about yourself and other people. So share that, figure out what that is, especially because you've returned recently and you want to write that down. You want to make sure you capture that, because it will fade with time. And defining your personal growth. So what is it that you want to do next? It's not that you studied abroad and now you're back and you're going to graduate and you're going to go on. How does it, maybe you want to do a graduate degree abroad. Maybe you want to go into the Peace Corps. Maybe you want to apply for a Fulbright or another type of a graduate scholarship program. What is it that you want to do? Maybe an international career. Obviously, it's really important to incorporate the study abroad experience into your job search, but you would be amazed at how obvious it is not to people. I have seen it so many times as one line on the bottom of a resume. It's not where it belongs. It actually belongs higher up. I told you I was a hiring manager for more than 10 years. If my attention was not captured in the top 1/3, maybe 1/4 of a resume, it went over here. By the way, if you had a typo, it went over there too. But that's you have to capture them. You have to actually, if you are a global citizen, globally aware, and you want to actually use your study abroad experience to help you in that job search, you got to talk about it. You have to prepare it. You have to prepare talking points, those stories I talked about. Prepare for job interview questions. Incorporate it into your cover letter. Just a little bit. It can't be overwhelming, but just a little bit so that there's enough interest. You also have to be prepared to sit across the desk from someone who could care less. There are people who could care less and don't want to know about it. And you need to sense that and actually move on and move around it. The other thing you can do, of course, as you're looking for jobs is seek out opportunities where you can continue this global experience, whether it's a job or opportunities maybe on campus if you're still studying. Language skills are really important. If you went abroad to actually enhance them, it's really important to keep it up. You know better than I do. You have to practice every day. There are all kinds of groups, clubs. You guys are so lucky that you live here. I mean, I'm just so amazed every time that I come here and I walk around, and that, there are languages, all kinds of languages. So really practice them and maintain that edge. Because also, if you go into a job interview, also be prepared. I'm sure the career counselors actually advise you on this. If you say you speak another language, be prepared to have someone either come into the room via Skype or walk right in and give you an interview in that language. That happens more and more. And actually, it was a great GW graduate, actually 2 years ago, told me, she said she spoke Spanish, Portuguese, and English, and it was for PricewaterhouseCoopers. And they said, okay. They left and they came back in and they asked her the same questions. And she was, she did really well, but they did want to know whether she was bluffing or not. I think used to be able to just put kind of a proficiency down there, and no one would test you because hardly anyone could speak some of these languages, right? But now you can be brought in from anywhere. And of course, go back a step. Advocate for greater global awareness. This is part of what you're doing and leveraging, but it's also really, really important. You're young people, you have a whole career ahead of you. maybe you'll have kids, maybe you know young people, encourage them, anyone that you know, to study abroad. And give them real reasons why, not just, it was great, it was fabulous. Because if they just want to travel and they just want to explore the world, a backpack and a ticket are a lot cheaper than a study abroad experience. And they're very different experiences, as I said, but encourage your friends, your colleagues, your family, anyone to actually study abroad. Go back to your high schools and talk about it to some of the, the current kids there now, and tell them about what you learned and why it's important and how it's affected your college career and maybe your professional career. Because it's really important that people like us in this room who are believers help actually other people appreciate and understand the importance of study abroad, yes, foreign language learning, yes, but global awareness, because really our national and economic security depend on it as a nation, and not just to prevent security issues like 9/11, but actually economic strength. It's very, very important that more Americans have this mindset, and actually they don't. So I'll step off my soapbox, but please, if every one of you can maybe try to convince one person actually to do that. I gave you some tips. I kind of ran through them very rapidly, and we're going to have a robust, rich discussion with our panelists, but there's a lot of information in A Student Guide to Study Abroad as well. It's a great book. We call it, it's kind of bulletized, so for those of you who don't have a lot of time to read, you'll be able to breeze through it really quickly. It's organized in a really nice way. And there are some actually people in the audience who actually contributed to the book and gave me some great quotes. I won't call you out right now. But it's great because there are a lot of great stories in there as well. So I'm going to like to invite our panelists to come up now. Chris Billing, who is a documentary filmmaker and a former correspondent. Chris Powers, who is the director of global education at the Institute of International Education. Vinitha Iyengar, who is, sorry, I lost my notes here, Principal, Sage Growth Partners, and General Manager of Canton Health Ventures. John McKeel, who is, I believe, an MBA grad from GW, as well as a senior consultant at Booz Allen. Charlene Justy, who is a study abroad operations assistant here on campus. And Ben Pocker, who is an undergraduate student and one of the contributors, actually, to A Student Guide to Study Abroad. Whoops. All right. So I'm going to take my place here. So I'm going to start by asking, actually, and we're going to have time for Q&A as well, but start asking each of the panelists why you believe that study abroad is valuable today.
Starting with me, hi, I'm Chris Billing. When you mentioned that only 1% of students study abroad, that really saddened me. I would have expected that it was much higher than that. Yeah. But
at 50% at GW undergraduate and graduate, I'm told. So.
Okay, well, because I feel like in my own life, like nearly all the cool and interesting things that have happened in my life and my career kind of date back to the fact that when I was a junior in college, I decided to spend some time studying in Israel. I kind of was really excited about this. I did all the due diligence. I found an Israeli woman in the neighborhood who I could learn Hebrew from before I went, which wasn't easy in upstate New York. It's not like there were a lot of Israelis running around. I found her, got myself kind of situated with Hebrew, went over there, kind of dove in with both feet. I bought a 10-speed and kind of biked around the whole country whenever I could. I volunteered at a local school for handicapped children. Of course, I continued the study of Hebrew. And that just kind of launched me into this whole kind of life that was completely unfamiliar to anyone in my family. This was trailblazing for my family. Leading to the fact that my first kind of real, if you can call it that, like real job was I actually taught Hebrew at Beijing University. Not being Jewish myself even, it was just kind of this really bizarre thing that happened. And it was after that I kind of went into journalism and started reporting from Beijing, which I did for a total of 11 years. The fact that I studied abroad to begin with, like, it was a very seminal moment in my life, and that kind of led to kind of everything else that came afterward.
Great, so a career opener, totally opened up a completely different path for you.
Yeah, and just a lot of unexpected twists and turns along the way. I thought I was going to be, first of all, a theologian, which is why I went to Israel in the first place. And then I thought I was going to be maybe like a Middle East expert or whatever. And then this whole China thing happened, and I ended up spending most of my career working on Asia things. So, but it all started with this fact that I went to study in Israel in the early 80s.
That's great. Yeah. Great. Okay, Chris?
Great. You know, I think it was about half or maybe 3/4 of you guys raised your hands, which is sort of the exact opposite number of folks who would raise their hands if you held this, you know, maybe at a different university or outside of a group where we focus on something like this, at a topic like this. And I think you listened to Stacie, some of the major issues or some of the real reasons why employers look for folks who've studied abroad, some of the cross-cultural skills you get and everything else. But to me, it's really simple. It's in this century, to be truly educated, you need to add an international component to your education. In the middle of the last century, only about 5% of the workforce had a college degree. And it was the people who had a college degree and then got graduate degrees that really were able to lead and really to make a difference compared to everyone else that they were competing against, working with. And I would be willing to bet that when we get to the middle of this century, it's going to be those who've studied abroad, those who've added that international component, who've become really educated, who've become the equivalent of those who got the college degree in the post-war period, who become the truly educated. So to me, studying abroad in this century means being educated. And it can take you everywhere from Europe to the Middle East, to Israel, to China, or to your own backyard. There is probably not an industry or a business or an organization that is not touched internationally. And if we want to work in these realms, we want to work with these individuals, we need to have the understanding to be able to work with people who come from different cultures and who have that background. So to me, it's just basic part of completing our educations.
That's great. Me?
You know, it's interesting because while I didn't do any formal study abroad, I've actually spent post my undergrad more time overseas than I've actually spent in the U.S. working. So I graduated in 2001, was in Asia, Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Singapore, between 2002 and 2009, and now I'm back in the U.S. But the reason I spent time abroad and I started my career overseas through the U.S. Peace Corps was I was sitting in New York City at an Afghan restaurant with a bunch of doctors. Happened to be my brother's friends. And when the discussion on regret came, a lot of them said the biggest regret was not doing a program like the Peace Corps or a study abroad program in their experience. And these were guys that were 22, 23, 23 years old. They were locked into a long-term career in medicine, and they felt that medicine would provide them with that inflexibility in pursuing a sort of a career abroad. Now, of course, that's changed. As Chris has said, and some of my colleagues have said, now there's going to be more opportunities for people in the science and engineering and business fields. But for me, the most important aspect of what I've been able to gain from a studied abroad experience is working in very ambiguous situations and being very creative and coming up with solutions to those ambiguous situations. I'm sure for some of those that are in business, the concept of reverse innovation has come up. So reverse innovation coined by Jeff Immelt of GE, and that concept has everything to do with developing technologies in emerging markets and reverse innovating it to a U.S. environment. So it's critically important to develop the kinds of skills, being entrepreneurial, testing yourself personally, professionally, working in ambiguous situations, because sooner than later, those are going to pay dividends when you do come back to the U.S., right? So I'm sure we're going to have a much longer conversation about this, but those are certain aspects that I felt, as from an international perspective, has benefited my career up till now.
Great. John?
So my first experience overseas was when I was 12 years old. My parents had accepted positions in a school about a few hours outside of Beijing in China, in an economic development zone. And it was eye-opening and expanding. I was about 1995, and so China was a very different place than it is now. And my whole family went over there, and we hadn't had much international experience at the time. My sister and I were very young, and my parents had spent most of their lives in the Midwest. In the Midwest, you don't travel much in those days. So when we got to China, it was an incredibly different world. It was stranger than we'd ever anticipated it being, because at that time in '95, no one spoke English, right? And culturally, like the West and the East can clash sometimes. And so I think, though, that there are many valid points as to why you should extend yourself and take yourself overseas. You gain an open perspective. It increases the thickness of your skin with ambiguity and getting yourself outside of the cultural norms here. But I think you also get this innate knowledge of understanding people in a different way. And when you put yourself into a different culture and a different context, you really are forced to stretch and learn more about yourself. And not only that, but the cultural implications, not only in a foreign and distant land, but in your own home. And when you sit down, you watch for interactions between human beings that you'd never watched before. And frankly, the world is based on relationships. And in an increasingly complex world, we're seeing that understanding these relationships in an international context is ever more important. So when I got back from China, I was about 2 years later, and it was 97-ish, and my first day back, I was sitting on the bus, and we were going on a field trip. And the kid next to me was so surprised. He was dumbfounded. He'd never met someone that went to China before. He said, "Wow, you lived in China? Can you speak Japanese?" And that stuck with me for the rest of my life, and we laugh now. But I mean, the implications of that are apparent in the statistics that we were just seeing. And the understanding that the United States is largely behind in this global world. And so I think, to package it up, there are a few reasons why I think you should go overseas. Obviously, open your mind, but open your ability to understand people and interact. That's incredibly important. So jump off the ship and dive deep into the culture. Stay away from the expats. Go find friends that you'd never, ever find anywhere else in the world. But also because as a global country, as the United States expands, it's so important for us to step out and understand the world internationally and the gifts that it has and the gifts that different cultures bring to you.
Great, thanks. Charlene?
Hello. My story starts in the South Bronx, where I'm from, and a totally unlikely kind of background with study abroad. Who here has had a Sweet 16 birthday party? And it's usually, or has done something that is equivalent to a very big celebration for a 16th birthday or a coming of age celebration. So when my parents asked me, what do I want to do for my Sweet 16 or my 16th birthday party, I asked them to go to Italy with my high school. And that was kind of the first time I'd stepped out of my comfort zone. And I don't know what inspired me to ask, because at the time it was I thought it would be a big financial burden, but I thought that I would anyway, just to see where I would get with it. And it turns out that my high school was hosting an educational foundation tour to Italy for 2 weeks during our break. So I asked for that during my as in replacement of my Sweet 16. And they added up the cost, and they said, actually, this is cheaper than throwing you a party, so we'll send you. And that was when I fell in love with study abroad, and when I caught the so-called travel bug. And I ended up choosing my university based on a study abroad component, and then ended up spending about 50% of my time in undergraduate abroad, whether it was on short-term faculty-led study programs in Brazil and France, where I studied language and culture, whether it was on international internship opportunities in Singapore and Ghana, which is in West Africa, or a traditional study abroad program that was in London, England. And And I kind of did the reverse, the reverse kind of study abroad path. Most people start on traditional, end up with kind of focused and work programs. But I like to say that my journey was first personal to study abroad and then professional. And I found value in both. So first, personally, I felt like I expanded my network of friends. I feel like I truly found myself. I figured out what my goals were. I figured out what I wanted to do with my life as far as career. And that grounded me more than anything else. Because I think that with my parents and the background that I come from and the family that I come from, not a lot of people travel. There's a very kind of one-sided 2D kind of outlook on life, and that is to just get a good job. Half of it wasn't even education. My father doesn't have a college education. So it was very one-sided, and to kind of break out of that, and that was a personal journey for me. So that was the first thing that I wanted to kind of break out of and be extraordinary at, and to find what I wanted to do and be very focused on that. And then the second thing was professional, to build my resume, to create the global network of people that I could reach out to for recommendations, for travel advice and things like that in the future, and to develop the kind of soft skills that I would need in the job market today. So I definitely think it's valuable both personally and professionally.
Great. Ben?
Wow, those pretty great introductions. So I have a little bit different of a perspective, given that I'm a senior undergraduate at GW in the business school. So I got back from my study abroad experience about a year ago now. Still regretting every day that I'm here, but it'll do. And so I've sort of had the experience of coming back and trying to actually leverage my abroad experience and the lessons that I learned when I was there into getting a job, getting a real job, an internship last year, and then coining that into a job this year. So it's been a really interesting experience, and I knew that I wanted to go abroad from a really young age. In fact, it's one of the main reasons why I went to GW, because when I came here, when my brother was visiting, actually, I was a freshman in high school, and they mentioned about every fifth word was study abroad, and that was 5 or 7 years ago, I guess now. And it really stuck with me. I loved traveling as a kid. I started studying Spanish in first grade, so languages always sort of came to me. But you don't really understand what studying abroad is all about until you come back. And I can honestly say that it changes your mindset. It changes how you think. It opens up a greater lens for you to look through into the world, and not just a professional world, but how you see people, how you see opportunities, how you see certain situations. And I would say that's the biggest thing that I learned. And we were talking about, Stacie was talking about how to leverage it in a job interview. And if you can leverage that, if you can say, I've changed my entire perspective on X, Y, and Z because of studying abroad, and here are the anecdotes that support that, people are going to be blown away, because I've been asked in every single one of my job interviews, about my abroad experience and how it's impacted me. And every time I've given sort of the same answer, and they really appreciate it. But I think that along with that, the global economy growing and globalization the way it is, all the statistics that you just saw, it's becoming essential. I agree with some of the panelists that it's not something that you can really choose anymore. I think that you almost have to do it if you want to be competitive in the job market and in the economy as a whole. So
That's great. What a great diverse group of panelists, different backgrounds, different experiences, different lifetimes. So I think we're going to have a nice conversation. That's terrific. I'm going to go through a couple of questions. We're going to ask, panelists asked a few at a time. The next question is, can you provide an example of when you felt that your international experience had a positive impact on your studies or career? Ben, would you like to actually expand on what you're talking about with job interviews?
So I guess I'll focus here on the actual job interviews and what people have talked about. I'm working next year in L'Oreal's luxury division doing strategy. So to be working for such a multinational company it's pretty great. They not only it's not only an option to go abroad, but they almost require it for any managing director or anything above that level. So it's really nice to be working with such an organization. And I would say that I've had interviews where people haven't been as receptive to the idea of studying abroad. So it's when you first get into an interview setting and they ask you about it and you talk about it, it's important for you to judge the company as well as for the company to judge you. Because I've had some interviews where I wasn't so impressed with how they reacted to it, because I know that I want an international experience in my professional life. And to work for a company that wouldn't concentrate on that or wouldn't want you to grow in that regard, it didn't appeal to me. And I think that it wouldn't appeal to you either if you had that experience and you had opened your mind up to other cultures and other ways of thinking. So.
That's a great point. Yeah, it's really important to actually, take a look at them as well. That's great. John, do you want to add something to that as well?
Yeah, so I think that when you take yourself into an international setting, you really open the doors in terms of how your brain works. And as Vineet was saying earlier, you learn to deal with ambiguity. And not necessarily, it doesn't matter where you go, whether you go to Paris, you go to Rwanda. What you start to understand, what you start to see is a different way of viewing the world. The longer you're there, the more you really grasp this. One of my experiences while I was in the MBA program was we went on a consulting abroad program, and we were actually with Professor Click. And we were working with a business development fund, and so they worked with small business loans, and the fund guaranteed loans to small business owners who had no collateral for taking out a loan from the bank. And so we did an economic analysis of the Rwandan economy to identify areas of growth for them and potential areas that they could develop themselves more. And when we were delivering our final product to the board, it was an absolute failure. It was a horrible, horrible experience. And we were under the gun for 30, 45 minutes. And it was so incredibly uncomfortable that when we left, like, all of us had probably sweat so much that we grabbed giant bottles of water and trying to rehydrate, and it was just this really strange experience. But we took into context that we had completely misunderstood the cultural implications in the room. And what we had walked away with was that while we had worked really hard and we had stayed up many late nights and delivered a really good product, we didn't gauge the client correctly. And we didn't read what he was needing and what he really wanted out of the meeting. And with that, what we did was, because of the cultural implications that we didn't see, we completely failed our project. Now, it was a personal growing experience, but professionally, it was quite interesting. And since we were still students, it was, I didn't get fired, so that was nice. And I've seen that. Working with China, where there's someone who sits in a room, and I watched a meeting with a very high-level Chinese bank fail because one party did not understand the implications in developing the relationship with a Chinese client. And these are the things that you won't grasp or you don't get just when you sit down in a room with somebody and meet them for the first time. You have to spend time in a place. You have to get to know the culture and get to know people personally. And studying abroad is a wonderful platform for doing that.
That's great. That's great. I want to talk about the specific skills that you felt were developed or enhanced as a result, not only of study abroad, but I think we can talk about whether it's time in the Peace Corps or working abroad, but that international experience. Vineet, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to beat this to a dead horse, but I think the ability, and we'll talk about it at length as well, but the ability to truly appreciate a country and what an emerging market has everything to do with understanding your vulnerabilities in a certain market or in a certain geography. When I went to the Philippines, it was just after 9/11. So their perception of Americans are not typically people who are Indian Americans, right? And so it was an interesting to sort of take a step back, and rather than sort of force your way in dictating how things should be done, you need to spend a significant amount of time listening, right? So even if you're going to a study abroad experience, really understanding the nuances of working in an environment, listening in an environment, and helping to develop a sort of a Rolodex of people that you can rely on and develop relationships in the long run is going to be key. And it's interesting in the previous question, because I've spent 7 years in Southeast Asia, and very few people actually know that ASEAN, so the Association of Southeast Asian Nations as a bloc, is a bigger trading partner to the US than China is, right? So I'm now getting invited by groups in Israel that want to start investing in Asia, groups in certain geographies in the US, and I'm from Louisiana. They want to start exploring more opportunities with ASEAN as a bloc. So the skills that I've learned in understanding those markets, understanding the geographic differences in not only economically, politically, but socially in certain markets, has proven to be a wise investment of my time in certain markets, but also making sure that you sustain the relationships in a lot of these markets has sort of proven to be paying dividends, in the long run. So I would implore, as you guys look at it, study abroad, and you identify a certain geography or region, to spend as much time understanding a variety of parameters, really building up your listening skills, and building up, most importantly, patience. I mean, it's not Stacie's been to 25 countries, and I'm sure
50.
More. Okay, so
75 actually.
75.
Too.
And I would imagine, if suddenly she goes to Italy tomorrow, there's going to be certain frustrations that are going to build up. If they say, Vineeth, go to Australia or go to some other market, there's going to be frustrations that are going to build up. So developing sort of the patience, but also developing the listening skills in any geographies is critically important.
Chris, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, talking about skills that I developed. Well, one, language for sure. I'm talking mostly about my time spent. I spent 11 years as a reporter based in Beijing, and I started off as a freelancer. And China is one of those places where certainly you need to be able to know Chinese to do interviews and that sort of thing. But you also need to be able to eat, to find sustenance. You got to be able to tell people what you want to do. So that was certainly something that was enhanced while I was there. The other cool thing about being in Beijing, again, I started off as a freelancer, and then start first of all with a position as a producer at CBS News there. And the beauty of that is overseas bureaus around the world, in China in particular, they're chronically understaffed. So they're looking for someone who's willing to do virtually anything. And they're more than happy to let you kind of learn on the fly. So I ended up learning how to do radio, learning how to do video editing, learning how to produce TV spots. Before I knew it, I was actually putting my mug on TV and doing TV spots. So it was kind of one of those experiences where you're offered a lot more opportunities more quickly in an overseas environment than you would be if I were trying to crack into like the DC bureau of CBS News here. There'd be many other people in front of me. In Beijing, there was nobody. So.
That's great. Yes, this is really interesting. So there are the soft skills that we've talked about, listening, paying attention, really being able to read the room. And many of you, since most of you actually have already been abroad, you can probably kind of, whether even you were just kind of at the market buying avocados or fruit or something, you can kind of pick up on those things. And then just dealing with the difference in the things that are changing, and just very practically, just taking advantage of whatever's there. That's terrific. That actually came out a lot in actually the research I did for my first book, which was you're offered these opportunities. And that's why going back to kind of like the developing markets and the emerging markets is actually you leverage the study abroad into a career. That's where those opportunities actually can take place. So that's great examples. Okay, so we're going to turn to where would you recommend students kind of study, intern, volunteer, or pursue work abroad? Because I really want to talk about that as well. Because is it fair to say that a lot of people maybe want some kind of an international career? Yes? Okay, good. The spotlight's a little tricky, but I think most of you raised your hand. Okay, great. Chris, do you want to talk about that?
Well, first, so many of you raised your hands when we asked if you'd studied abroad. How many of you guys have gone to Europe? And how many to Asia? Latin America? Africa? Did I miss a part of the world? That's my answer. Yes. Go anywhere. Go everywhere. There's not a good answer. There's not a correct answer. You can look at emerging markets. You can look at major trading partners. You can look at where you might have language or family background. I mean, there are a lot of look at Americans who go to, say, Korea, and the vast majority of them are Korean Americans. But it doesn't mean Hispanic Americans or Indian Americans or Anglo-Saxon Americans can't go there either. And why not? You should go where you want to go and where your interests and career interests are. Sometimes it's where your professor had a connection. I work on programs that promote study abroad outside of Western Europe. And so I go around and talk to students and say, yeah, you should go to the Middle East, you should go to China. I mean, Middle East is probably the most important geopolitical part of the world, through the Cold War, certainly now with terrorism and oil and things like that. But the numbers who go there are minuscule. And most who did, before everything happened in Egypt, most were going to just one country. They're not going to the Gulf where so much business happens. They'll go to Egypt, or maybe they'll go to Morocco where Arabic there is practically a different language. But you shouldn't listen to somebody like me or any of us who will tell you where you should go. You should go where you want to go, and I think you should just go. And don't wait for the perfect opportunity. There are lots of opportunities where you can go, and you should go and learn your languages and build that. But if you don't speak a language, or if you insist, and I don't think any of us are incapable of learning languages, even at late times in our lives, but don't let that be the thing that stops you either. Certainly lots of Anglophone countries where you can speak English, but lots of study abroad programs where you can do your coursework in English and you can study the language beyond that. I think that's important, that you don't forget the target language or the host language where you're going. I think some of the things that you bring back are going to be very specific to the country, are going to be very specific to that region, especially if you want to work there and you've built connections and networks there. But you're also going to build what we keep calling soft skills, and we keep calling cross-cultural skills. To me, a cross-cultural skill is not so much that you know how to work with the Chinese. Yes, that's a cross-cultural skill. You understand maybe their business norms and can work there and help your colleagues who might not understand that. But you also learn to work where your plan doesn't work, where your ideas don't work, and you learn to problem solve. And if you can do that in China, you can figure out maybe what happened when you're in India, and maybe you can do that in South America, or you can do it in Africa too. So I don't know if you wanted me to give a specific answer, but I'm saying all of the above.
No, yes, and that's a great answer, because actually there is such diversity, and a lot of people say, oh, I spent time in Italy, is that going to harm me? No, of course not. And your answer is brilliant, right. So that's great. Right. My time in Hong Kong, when I came back to D.C., and actually I had a similar experience, they asked me if I spoke Japanese because I was in Hong Kong, in Washington, D.C., so it wasn't a 14-year-old on the bus. It was my colleagues in an office on K Street, so it was really kind of shameful. When I came back, it was that I had this international experience. I did a lot in Asia, but then they sent me all over Europe, Middle East, and Latin America. So I totally agree. And Ben, you went to France. So a lot of people are talking about these other places. So tell us about that.
So I went actually to the GW business program in Paris, and that was pretty specific. I'm not sure if I would have gone to France if it weren't for that program, but I was choosing between sort of China and Western Europe, because at the time I was taking Chinese as well. And I'm really glad that I went to Western Europe, even though I know it advocates against it, or professionally.
No, not against it.
I know. But
I went to London, so.
Okay, so we're fine. The travel opportunities I found in Western Europe are pretty uncomparable. It's amazing to jump on a train be in Amsterdam in 2 hours. And in China, you're in China for 15, 16 hours driving. So it's honestly it depends on what you want. As everyone here said, it's completely up to you. I would definitely advocate do some research, do a lot of research, find out from friends where they've gone, what they've liked about it, and then align that with your interests, because I know people who have ended up in places and really haven't liked it because of the culture, and because the culture shock lasted a little bit too long and they were just there for a semester, and so they really couldn't get over it. So I think doing your due diligence and figuring out where is a good fit for you is probably the most important thing. I loved Paris and I loved Western Europe, but that's just me, and I think that later in my professional career I would love to go to Asia or to South America, the Middle East, do something different. But I think it's a fit thing. It's really what you want.
And I think what's interesting is you were able actually to leverage that, even though you took classes in English, even though you speak French, and so you were actually even able to leverage that, which is great, which is wonderful. That really supports what you're saying. It doesn't necessarily matter. It's all what you make of it, and you've obviously made something great of it. Did you want to add something, Charlene?
Yeah, I wanted to say that I work in the Office for Study Abroad, and two of the largest, I guess, countries that students gravitate towards is the UK and Italy. And while those are great options, I want to encourage students to figure out if they're an adventurer or not, because a lot of students come in with their mind set on certain programs, and that's fine. Knowing what you want and going for that is a great skill and kind of a great thing to do and to have that in mind. But if the program itself doesn't fit you, even though you have this region in mind or this country in mind, I would encourage people to be open to other programs that might fit their needs and their, I guess, coursework and academic profile, rather than just sectioning themselves off to this one region or to this one country based on your idea of what it might be like, rather than what fits your academic profile or your coursework or just your personal interest. Because some people get blinded by the fact that they just want to go to Western Europe, or they just want to go to Australia, or they just want to go to China. And if you have a program in the Middle East that fits the needs of your coursework and that might fit you better as an individual, why not adventure into that? Even if all of your friends are going to Australia, think outside of the box and kind of be the person that takes that extra step and does the research and think about it in a different way, other than I'm not getting what I want.
Can I add something? So this is a very important question, and the way I would structure it, when people ask me about where, if I were to live or work abroad, where would it be? I mean, I tell people nowadays, in hindsight, that it's important nowadays to think strategically in terms of a particular region, right? And so there's enough research and data points, whether it's McKinsey, that produces research today that says that there's a larger middle class in sub-Saharan Africa than all of India combined, right? I mean, that's amazing, right? And so we're talking about countries like Ghana, we're talking about Kenya, developing let's say a subject matter expertise in those countries, I think would be compelling, especially for an MNC. Take a look at Colombia, for instance, in Latin America. They've just signed a free trade agreement with the US, and it's been recognized as a country where you can not only explore and learn Spanish, but be part of a groundbreaking environment in which you're going to command, top dollar, in the long run, right? And so I think, and of course, BRICS was popularized by Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley and all those banks, and now they've identified what they consider the next 11 countries. So, countries like the Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam, Mexico, countries that have great growth rates. Great demographics, purchasing powers for its middle class is increasing, which means what? That companies like Unilever, Nestle, P&G are going to want to start penetrating those markets even more. So if you want to take a look at it strategically, I think developing, getting as much of the secondary sources and primary research on understanding sort of the demographics and trends would be a great opportunity if you want to sort of start planning now. Short-term, medium-term, and long-term, as you look at a sort of international career through study abroad.
Yeah, and also graduate work.
Yeah.
Some people may want to pursue graduate work. And I think it's really quite interesting, actually, whether you go and maybe do an MBA here, or there are all kinds of international programs, actually, where you can do your full graduate studies in another country as well. And those are really interesting to look at. Some actually, sorry, GW cost actually a whole lot less than it costs actually to get a graduate degree here in the US. And you have that deep immersion as well. There are great scholarships and things as well to actually pursue that way. So look at it like that as well, kind of where you want to go. That's great. So I want to ask, kind of as an employer, so a lot of people have studied abroad. So especially for those of you actually who do hire people, whether it's in the not-for-profit or in the private sector, what does study abroad say to you? So you see it on a resume. You know, what does it say to you if you were asked to interview somebody? John, you want to start?
So I think the first thing that it says is that you have more of an open mind, right? So living overseas sparks entrepreneurial thought processes, right? Some of the most innovative people I've met in the United States are people who don't traditionally come from the United States. I've learned so much from my international friends here because when they get to the United States, they have to figure things out, right? They have to learn. They have to step outside of what they know as their comfort zone to learn how to operate and live in a new environment. And what this does is it sparks thought processes that you don't traditionally have when you're comfortable, right? And so taking buses or different aspects of living in an environment, a new environment, when you live overseas, you think differently. And so I think number one, as hiring individuals, it shows me that they can think on their toes and open their minds to look at a problem in a different way.
So is that something that they should stress maybe in an interview, or in how, you have an example of maybe how they might talk about their open-mindedness or make a link maybe to?
Absolutely. I think there are a few ways to do that. You can leverage an experience that you've had overseas. People love to hear stories, right? And not only because stories provide color and context to the information that you're giving them, but also because it tags a personal aspect of you to them. So think of something that you had to do overseas, an experience that you had that stretched you, or in which you had to figure out, you had to solve a problem that you couldn't traditionally solve, and explain it in those terms.
Great. Chris, do you want to?
I don't have much to add to this. I will say when I was, so the last 5 years I spent in Beijing, I was heading up the NBC News Bureau there. And we were always looking for even students on the ground to come in and lend a hand. In fact, to be honest, we were kind of surprised how few people would kind of make the effort to come by and just say, hey, is there anything I can do? Because we'd love to have an extra pair of hands and some extra eyes and ears around the city, around Beijing, who could kind of help us when news was breaking. That kind of thing was invaluable to us, and we were kind of surprised that fewer people than we expected would stop by. There were always a few, and we were always more than happy. And during important news times, for example, when I was there, President Clinton visited, so we wanted to kind of bulk up the bureau. So we actually went out to Beijing University and some of the other universities around town, and went around to the foreign student dormitories and like, anybody who can help us out,
That's great. Great. Yeah. Chris, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, I'm at the Institute of International Education, and we're driven by our mission, which is to help students and professionals cross borders, both coming to the United States, other places. So what we do is promote study abroad. We promote international mobility in all directions. And we hire people who share that commitment to the mission. And one of the easiest ways to demonstrate that is by studying abroad. So it's not a requirement, but it's an easy way to make sure we understand your values and we get your values. But I'd also say, we hire plenty of IT professionals and accountants and others who, you don't need to have worked overseas to necessarily master those skills and competencies. But we know that if they're going to be working in our environment where we're working on these issues, they're going to understand it. And they're going to know why it's so important to get that scholarship check to that student in the Middle East before Ramadan or something like that. So they'll have a basic understanding. And I think that goes across the different sectors of the work that we do.
That's great. That's great.
And
do you want to add something?
As a person who was interviewing for a position that was going abroad, Before I came here to GW, I worked for a program in Boston called the NUN program that runs out of Northeastern University, and it takes first-year college students abroad. I was applying for a position that was categorized as an international student advisor, and I had to use my experience in Singapore working. I ended up connecting the experience I had in Singapore working for a small media production company to the experience of advising American students abroad in England. And basically, I used the experience where I got used to the 12-hour day, because the international student advisor experience, it was like a 24-hour kind of on-call position where if a student was on fire in zone 5, you would have to go get them. And they were like, how would you feel about that? And I said, well, I've gotten used to the 12-hour day. I worked in Singapore, and at first, when you're getting your bearings, you're like, excuse me, you want me to work how many more hours? But, and then I got my bearings, and I said, okay, this is going to be my norm. And I had to learn how to advocate for myself, and that's something that they apparently were really looking for, and that I ended up getting the position. But afterward, they told me, they said, yeah, that's crazy that you connected that experience, but I think if you make those connections before you get into an interview, I think that's really important when you're going in front of employers, because no one would have thought that I would have connected that experience of all of my international work experience, study experience, to a job that was going abroad to England and not somewhere in Asia.
And just quickly, in my case, whenever I look at resumes that has someone that spent time overseas, always the first thing that comes to mind is this person took a chance, right? Mm-hmm. He took a chance on himself and decided that it was important enough for him to spend time and sort of stretch themselves both personally and professionally. And why that's important to me is that, in the US and also globally, business is all about mitigating risk, right? And when we need if we need to staff up quickly, if we have a very difficult, complex project that we're looking for volunteers, the first person that invariably comes up that does volunteer for that engagement or assignment is someone that's spent time overseas, because they've understood and have developed a mastery of certain skill sets or through thought leadership that they've developed, that they can handle those engagements. So, they took it upon themselves to take a chance to work overseas, developed really cool skills, thought processes, and those are typically the people that we favor over, perhaps others that may not have the experience abroad.
That's great. So what Chris was saying was it's essential to an education these days.
Right.
That's great, because more and more people are looking for it. And not just if you're doing things overseas, but just think about our, the cross-cultural mix in the United States. I mean, it's tremendous here, right? You'd think that we would be the best at this in the world, but we're obviously not. So those of you who have these skills, it actually is a great differentiator. This is really interesting, because all of these different backgrounds and sectors, what's really coming through for me is that it's really important that you prepare, that you take a look at what skills you learned, what you developed, how the experience affected you, where the growth was, and think about where you're hiring or what you're pursuing next, and make those relevant connections and really think about it. Because sometimes people want to put the study abroad in a box, especially when you come back and your friends are like, oh, great, fabulous. Did you hear we won the football game or whatever? I mean, those kinds of things are really tough because people aren't really interested. So many times in the research that I've done, study abroad students tend to kind of put the experience away and don't want to talk about it because they're like, oh, there she goes again. She's talking about her time in Peru. I mean, and they roll their eyes. But you should be very proud of that. And you should make those connections and really do the research to make those links, because it's really important. I'm going to ask all of the panelists one more question before we actually take your questions. And I know there's a mic up there. So I'm going to give them a choice. So you can either describe kind of like what having a global persona means to you, and or just give a kind of another piece of advice, something that we haven't covered, to make sure that we capture everything. Ben, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. So what a global persona means to me.
Sure. Or a tip that you want to give, whichever.
Or a tip that I want to give? Mm-hmm. Well, I'll do what a global persona means to me. So I think that having a global persona is almost a global mindset, and I think it comes in many forms. I think that by having a global mindset, you're opening yourself up to another way of thinking and almost a different approach to life itself. And I think that is the most important thing that you can get out of studying abroad, and that's the most important thing that you can leverage, is that you're not just contained in this society that you grew up in. You know, that you opened your mind up and you opened your experiences up to failure and to a different approach to things and frustration and all of these different aspects of it. So I think that having a global persona is an identity that is beyond sort of a resume or beyond something that you can give to someone or in a sentence. It's embodying what you should take away from an international experience. I think it's really important.
That's great. Charlene?
My idea of a global persona is actually an addition to the things that make up your identity. I think that having been abroad, having studied abroad, having worked abroad, and had these unique set of experiences connects you to other people. So I think that it's a part of your personality. It becomes a part of your personality. It becomes a part of what you disclose to people when you have conversations. So I think it's an added layer of identity. I think it's also a network because you can connect with others easily, depending if they have whether they have been abroad. It's an easy icebreaker. It's something that helps you relate to people personally and professionally. It actually can change the circles that you're in, both personally and professionally. And I think it's an added layer of identity that some people, you said, choose to take off and put in a box depending on their personal circles. But if they choose to wear it and choose to disclose, they're able to kind of move into different networks and to move into different circles. So either people put it away and they stay in their same kind of box before they went, or they realize they've changed, like you said, and disclose and change the people that are around them and change their professional working relationships.
Great. A real door opener. And as Ben was saying, just kind of a mindset, kind of a shift in the way you think about everything. Great.
So I think that having a global persona really is about being ambidextrous. It's about finding new skills that you didn't know that you had, being able to juggle the ball with both hands. It's about being able to take yourself in a time of frustration and understand that while you're at home, or when you work in your home home country, you leave work and you go home, right? But when you work in a different country and you're learning a new environment, it's frustrating. There are times when you don't know how to get out of this, and you are put in places where you just don't get it. You don't understand the cultural context. You don't understand the language sometimes. But what you have to do is dig deep inside yourself to find these skills to walk and operate in a new way. And it's being able to take yourself and plant yourself in situations that you didn't know how to deal with before. And understand that ambiguity and create structure out of it, right? And so I think being global not only is about yourself, though, but about other people. And it's about learning to respect and love the gifts of a global society. And I think those two go very much hand in hand. So a last thought, what I would stress everybody to do, you have a lot of information from what everybody wanted to give you. And I think that it's all very valuable. And so take all of these pieces in context and take and choose what you need. But stretch yourself. Whether you're going to Paris or whether you're going to Africa or whether you're going to the Middle East or Latin America, if you know where you want to build your expertise, then that's definitely very helpful. But if you already know that, then take another country and stretch yourself. Choose a place on the map that you never thought you would ever travel to, and put yourself in a context that you have no idea what you're getting ready for. And you'll grow, and you'll learn, and you'll develop yourself in ways you never knew.
Right. And that's true for not just going abroad, but in anything you do and anything you pursue. It's great advice, Stretch.
To build off what John said, I'm very happy to have seen, I think when we did a sort of an informal survey in the beginning of this, that most everyone has done a study abroad. So my call to action to you guys is, if you've done study abroad or if you've done an internship in one geography, then either continue to mine those experiences to spend more time in that geography, or spend time in another area, right? I've spent quite a bit of time in understanding the market in Colombia, for instance, in my previous employer. And I can't tell you how many large MNCs, multinational companies in Colombia have said, if I had someone that spoke not only both Spanish but Mandarin, those guys would be, I mean, gold. And the reason he was saying that, or she was saying that, was because, one of the largest, foreign direct investors in a place like Colombia happened to be the Chinese, right? So I would, so my call to action is, I think you guys have all done the study abroad, and you truly appreciate what those experiences mean to you, both personally and professionally. But the next step would be to deepen those relationships, those embedded relationships, whether in the same market that you want to operate in, study in, or what have you, or to spend time in another geography. So.
Great.
So I like so much of what my friends and colleagues here have said. And what's really interesting to me is how we've talked about taking what you learn overseas and bring home. But talking about different boxes, make sure you don't take these as separate boxes. We did a workshop last week, and we're talking about being at home in the world. So think of yourself as being a bigger person, your own environment being bigger once you've gone overseas or once you expand your understanding. And make sure you don't forget about that when you come home. That would be the first thing I'd say. And then secondly, I'm going to take this opportunity too to give you a call for action. If we do believe if you all believe what we've all said, that's great, and we appreciate that. Most of you have gone abroad before. You might go on and say, okay, this is how I'm going to use it in an interview. This is where I'm going to go to work. I'm going to go overseas. And that's going to be great. You guys are set. You've got an opportunity to be different and to stand out compared to the 9 out of 10 students who aren't going to have that experience. But for our country and for the world, that's not good enough. As good as you can be, we need more people like you. So my call to action to you guys would be for each one of you, especially if you've gone abroad before, to convince one more person to do it. Your younger brother, your older sister, a girlfriend, best friend, frenemy, anybody. You can convince anybody to do it for a short term. And that's something we've not talked about here tonight. There are all different kinds of opportunities, from very short week, May and winter semester programs to summer programs to semester to full year, or to longer term where you might be working abroad. Encourage them to find the right one for them. So I'd encourage you all to get one more person.
Excellent. Another advocate.
All right, I'll make this brief, but I'll go back to the whole cultural persona thing. But to a large extent, and I don't mean to be too flippant about this, but I think to a large extent having a cultural persona kind of turns you into a bit of a freak. Like when you come back, when I first moved back to the United States after 11 years in China, my mother would love to take me out to meet her friends, and she lives in suburban New Jersey. And she kind of wanted me to start talking about my experience over there, and that was people didn't know that was a conversation starter. Nobody knew what to do with that. And it didn't help that she would introduce me as, my son Chris from China. That already confused people enough. And one great thing about living in Washington, D.C. is here is one of the few places in America where there is a large number of people who have overseas experience that actually can relate and might even be a little bit interested in your experience. So I think a lot of people, when they first come back from, especially studying abroad experiences, and many of you can possibly relate to this, or even living overseas for an extended period of time, is you just don't feel like you fit in anymore, and it can be really tricky.
Yeah, and so finding like-minded souls is really important, because it can be very lonely to be that freak. Yes, yes, we've all been there. Yeah, great. And so I think we have some time for questions now. Anyone have any? You can kind of go up to the mic. You don't have to. You can identify yourself if you'd like, or stay incognito.
Hi there. First, thank you very much for this. My name's Callie Manis. I'm actually the president of the International Education Association here at GW. So my focus is on study abroad and exchange. And my question is kind of from a different perspective. So I work sending students abroad. But what can I do as the educator, as the programmer, to help the students when they come back or while they're abroad to leverage these experiences, to reflect on these experiences, and to make them take it as more than just the boxed experience? Is there anything that you say, oh, I really wish someone would have helped me through this, or I wish someone would have made me sit down and really focus on these aspects?
Sure.
As the programmer, as the educator, I would implore you to make sure that you have an extensive pre-departure orientation, because I think being able to serve students when they come back is also goes hand in hand with serving students before they leave, and making sure that their expectations are tempered, making sure they have all the information and the resources that they need before they go, understanding that identity is going to be a huge factor in a lot of their interpersonal relationships and connections with people, I think that's a huge part as a programmer, as an educator, and bringing students abroad, sending students abroad, receiving them back, because I feel like the more prepared they are before they go, the more prepared they'll be for reentry, and the better you'll be able to serve them. Because if you give them the tools on how to reflect and how to manage their expectations before they go, I think it makes for a more even-keeled W curve, or a more even-keeled, a culture shock than it would if you hadn't sent them on had given an extensive pre-departure orientation. And they'll be able to recognize the times when they were in crisis. They'll be able to recognize how they were feeling and reflect better on those experiences when they come back, and be able to better tell you what they need, what kind of resources they need.
Go ahead.
I'd suggest you meet the students where they are. I think we in our field, especially those who work in this area, have done a lot of great research and can cite that research and can give plenty of talks to our fellow educators about the best way to do it, the best way to give reentry conferences and sessions and so forth. But what we'll do is we'll put up a chart with the W curve, and we'll tell them at this period of time you will feel elation, and then you'll feel depression, and then you'll come back. And most students are going to look at that and say, "What? I just want to go to the football game with my friends, and why can't they understand how cool it was?" So they're not going to put themselves in our theory. They're going to fit in somewhere along that theory, but they're not going to put themselves there. So if you have a session that's reentry, come share your problems with everybody, they're not going to come. But meet them where they might be, which is, how do I leverage this into a career? And then, or a networking opportunity to talk to people and eat pizza. And then maybe the issues that come up can come up sort of naturally and organically. That's what I'd encourage as much as I could.
I mean, I think as much as you can, and then depending on the size of the number of students that are being sent under your sort of purview, I think it's important to have and develop a regular rhythm with these guys in terms of communications. Even if these guys are abroad, having Skype conversations or facilitating some sort of avenue in which virtually people can come together to share experiences, best practices, perhaps even on a regular basis or on a quarterly basis, bringing an employer to participate in a sort of a Skype conversation, I think is going to help create a mental clock for these guys, so that when they do come back, it's not sort of shock and awe, right? And that's where even in the Peace Corps, the biggest problem is often when people do come back, because they've spent 2.5 years or what have you in a certain geography. They come back, they're not feeling appreciated, and I think what's important, and what the Peace Corps, I would always tell the Peace Corps this, any day, and I think they know this is sort of an issue, is as much as you can start to create a mental clock by bringing people and resources, communicating with them while they're in the field, it's going to help that readjustment or re-entry process when they do come back. And they can hit the ground running when it comes to employment. A lot of these guys, they've spent X number of years, months overseas. Sometimes they forget the competitive process in terms of applying for jobs here.
And I think reentry actually is still a huge problem in corporate America. I mean, I was joked that when I went to Hong Kong, I was given a culture shock book for Hong Kong before I walked out the door. No cross-cultural training at all, and I think that's really important to have beforehand, but it's also important to have with reentry. And it's not just the conferences. You really need those tools to actually give the students, as people have said, to meet them at their point, because intervention is important. There's, have you heard of What's Up with Culture? That's great, actually, a great thing. But I think, because I'm a big believer in this. I think because students, they get lost. They learn you're freaks, you don't know how to use it, you put it in a box, and then you don't know what to do with it. But I think the networking events, finding other people who have maybe been on similar situations and having a buddy system, if that works, if people are looking for things. Having them write down their experience and putting it somewhere to share so that they actually can share it somehow. That kind of networking. And I think building bridges. Do you have bridges with the career counselors on campus?
Yes.
That's really important. Actually, the two of you guys working together to actually help students do that. But then you're still going to have people falling through the cracks. And it's really important to figure out, asking students, what could we have done better, years later? You have one right here. We won't put him on the spot now, but how was that for him? He and I have talked about that, but maybe it's not as as positive as we'd like. But I think it's a really critical thing to actually take care of. But companies can't even get it right. They don't spend the time or the money actually doing it. But there's a huge wave of cross-cultural kind of training that's actually been coming out for retention purposes. But hopefully that actually kind of helps. Does that help?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, great. Great. Anybody else?
First off, I wanted to say something about what you guys just said. You should check out CIBER. I went to their conference last year, and they're all about cross-cultural training, especially in the workplace. I'm sure you've all heard. My name's Ellen Street, and I'm doing professional development for international education. I'm working now. And so I spent 2 years abroad, one in high school and one in college in southern Spain. I always wanted to go to Europe. I love the languages there. It was just the place for me. I didn't travel a lot. I just stayed with my group of friends and really got into the culture. So as I'm sending out my resume to different jobs, the problem is I think they see Spain on my resume and go, oh, okay, Spain, another one of you, So the perceptions, the different perceptions between, say, Kenya and Spain, how can you make that stand out on a resume? Because I can't talk to every employer, but they do get to see my piece of paper.
I think what's important, and I think we've talked about this a lot, is you've learned a lot. It's not just, and I think Chris was talking about this and Vinith was talking about this, it's not just that one geography. You've learned a lot. So what are those skills that you've learned? How have you made those connections? How can you apply those to whatever it is that you're doing? Because I think there's a misperception that just because you studied abroad in one country, all of a sudden you're a Spain expert, right? No, that is not the case, right? It is not the case. And so they want to know what it is about your time there, the ambiguity, the open-mindedness, the dealing with, problems on the spot. So talking about that as a broader experience and how it makes you a better candidate for this job because of this reason, I think that really actually is really critical, is expanding. And do you want to?
So to add on to that, I think the first step you should take is talk about your experience verbally. Meet with friends, meet with colleagues, meet with your parents, with somebody, because we don't often realize the experiences that we've had until we're conceptualizing them ourselves. But then think outside of the box in terms of what you did, right? When I moved to Taiwan initially, I was one of the only English speakers in a group of expats or Chinese speakers, sorry. One of the only Chinese speakers in a group of expats. And so I was relied upon a lot of the time to help people through situations that they didn't know how to navigate. And I had never lived in Taiwan. I spoke Chinese, but I'd never lived in Taiwan. So I was learning some of these things myself. But I organized a trip, a week-long trip to go hiking in the mountains of Taiwan. And I did this for a group of expats. So take these experiences that you start to rehash through these conversations, and don't just say you lived in Spain, provide some color to that. When I was in Taiwan, I organized a beach cleanup on a polluted beach, right? And those are the things that you did because you did them in Spain, right? We all live. But those are the things that you did that don't say that you lived in Spain. It says that you cleaned up a beach in Spain or Taiwan. But that'll help you in terms of thinking outside of the box and really putting life to your resume.
What? Really quick.
please.
What I was told by a really good professor that I had in Paris was on your resume, don't like put it at the top, as Stacie mentioned, and then also like put something underneath it. Like I put 2 courses because I took a European economics course like with a guy who worked on the IMF, and he was that. So that was like one of the highlights of my semester in Paris. So I would say write a little, not necessarily a blurb, but maybe 1 or 2 cool things or courses you took or experiences you had or people you met with, and just write it in small letters under the university you attended or something, just so it gives them an idea that, okay, she's not just another person from Spain. You know, because I went to France, it's the same thing. Like everyone goes to France, everyone goes to Spain. So just differentiate yourself like in that regard. That's what I was told.
Very distinct.
It's
That's great.
You said something that was very important. You said that you were there in high school and you're there in college, right? And what companies like to see is not only personal growth, but professional growth, right? And so I think it would be compelling to an employer to demonstrate and to show what you were able to learn and pick up when you were a high school student, what you were able to learn and pick up when you were a college student, that gap between high school and college, what you learned in high school in terms of yourself, professionally, personally, how you were able to apply it during your courses, whether in teamwork situations or whether in student activities, and then taking what you did as a college student and now how are you applying it. And so I think that's a key differentiator because most people have not spent a significant time abroad as a high school student, right? And so, I mean, if I was an employer and you were to position it that your time in Spain was in sort of encapsulated in that way, I think that would make it more compelling as an employer for me.
And I would think you're a risk taker too.
Right.
That's what I would think. You're a total risk taker.
Yeah.
And just to add, I mean, probably your job description didn't say we want somebody who studied in Spain. You know, that's probably not one of the skills they're looking for, but it's something else. So looking at the job description or the advertisement and seeing what are the skills that they're looking for and what you could have done in Spain or anywhere else is something you're probably not losing out to the person who studied in Kenya because they studied in Kenya and you studied in Spain, but that person might have been able to describe how they led a campaign to clean up the beach or do something else. And those are the key things, because when people are hiring, we do want to see that you're open-minded and able to handle ambiguity and things like that. But really, we want you to be able to do the job that we're hiring you for. And we look for examples on your resume and then in interviews where you have shown or demonstrated that you can do the things that you'll be doing on the job. And that's where you look at it. And if you can relate it to what you've done abroad, just like if you can relate it to internship experiences here, that's what you should be looking for, I'd say.
Great. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Great. Okay.
Good evening. Fantastic panel. Thank you so much for coming, and really enjoyed listening to you. My name is Stuart Levy. I teach in the Hospitality and Tourism Management program here in the School of Business, as well as Marketing. And I advise a number of our students on the undergraduate and graduate level, so hearing a lot of things about studying abroad. Though there are a couple of things that I'd love your insight on, especially the students and some of the folks who are working in this area. One is shorter term programs. It feels like we're talking quite a bit about the semester or year-long types of programs. The second area, what I'm hearing about as well, is studying domestically rather than studying internationally. I know that may not be as much of that cross-cultural component. And then the third part being the university-sponsored programs versus the outside affiliate types of programs. So I don't know if any of you or all of you could provide some either insights or your thoughts on those one, two, or three areas. Thank you.
Want to start with time?
Yes. So the first question was about short-term study abroad programs. And GW offers short-term faculty-led study abroad programs. And short-term programs are usually faculty-led. They're usually led over spring breaks over the semester, in the summer, and on winter break or fall breaks. So I'm working now with faculty to develop programs to turn their domestic curriculum or their course into an international program. So, for example, we have a professor, Tom Long, who teaches about Normandy, the Battle of Normandy. It's all about the Battle of Normandy. And he takes students, he took about 13 students to Normandy over the spring break, and he made that a component of his coursework. So it's about having faculty that are dedicated to that experience because they take on a lot of responsibility during that time. So for the Office for Study Abroad here, it's about making these kinds of, I guess, alternative courses appealing and having faculty kind of do the legwork, use their resources, use their connections in their global networks, and make that a resource and extend that resource to students. So we are seeing, I guess, more and more short-term study abroad programs develop, and it's also being said that short-term programs are giving more context to students than a lot of long-term programs. So students are shifting towards a short-term curriculum because it works in their 4-year plans. It gives them a little bit more flexibility as far as finishing school on time. But that's definitely, I think, something that's coming in the future more and more.
Yeah.
So and to add on to the short-term program, I was lucky enough in my internship in the MBA program to be part of the mayor of DC's trade delegation to China. And it was a phenomenal experience, absolutely phenomenal. But what I found also is my second year in the MBA, I spent a week over spring break in Nantes, France, to do a CSR study abroad. And so it was, what I found was how incredibly similar they were. Both were incredibly fast-paced, very intense, and exhausting, because people are not only trying to learn the content and the classroom or delegation information, but also trying to adjust to a culture and time differences. And so I think packaging a short-term study abroad well is very difficult, and it's an art. Because you have to make sure that you are not only providing content that is enriching, but also being respectful of energy levels and of times. So in the study abroad and in the mayor's delegation, I can't tell you how many people I saw sleeping on buses. People are exhausted. Actually, in our trip to Rwanda as well, I think we had a picture from the front of a bus, which we were looking back, and 80 or 90% of the students had all fallen asleep on the bus, just because it's so draining. And so I think it's important to remember that when you're building a short-term.
I think it's about positioning, and I think it is about branding it. And I think you have to have an explanation for it. And you shouldn't be excusing yourselves and, I only went for two weeks. I mean, any time abroad is valuable time abroad. It is all how you package it, and you actually talk about that experience, because you could take a deeper dive, and maybe you are with fellow American students and with an American professor, and some people say, well, how did you really dive deep into the immersion? Well, maybe you weren't really. You didn't have a home stay. You weren't there for a semester or a year. But for students who've done that, you've maybe had a much richer deep dive into one component and work that. I mean, your students should work that and talk a lot about that.
The majority of Americans who do go abroad do it for a short period of time, less than 8 weeks. That's been where the major growth has been over the last several years. Just like I said, like anywhere in the world, I'd encourage anywhere. I wouldn't turn my nose up at a short-term experience either. But you do get, just say, so there's about 300,000 American students go overseas each year, and over 50% of them do it for less than 8 weeks. Contrast that with just China, the Chinese students in America. About 300,000 Chinese students are in America, and they come for a degree. So when we're talking about all this world, this interconnected world, that's a big disconnect. So absolutely, yes, if they can do a short-term period, do it. Hopefully that piques an interest that they come back and do a longer-term period later, a gap year after graduation, a Fulbright or a Boren Fellowship or Peace Corps or some other experience. So I would never turn my nose up at that or say that that's invaluable. but just looking at the world we're in and where else the other people, what other countries and cultures are doing, I'd always encourage someone to think about going a little bit longer.
Yeah. And your second question was about domestic. What did I didn't
Well, I know
quite
we are
understand.
starting in the business school to offer some more short-term programming that is domestic, and just was wondering as well any trends or thoughts on that being. I know that wouldn't necessarily fall into the office of study abroad. It's a stranger animal, but just what the thoughts would be if that's an area that the school should be focusing on, that I should be advising on, and what students think about that.
As an employer, I personally employ people and hired people. Anything that gets them out into the real world, and I know people don't like that phrase, but I'm sorry, it's true, gets them out there and experiencing it for real so you can actually begin to use those great tools that you've been taught is great. And something that is diverse and different, whether it's a different geography or a different, whatever it is that's different is always valuable, of course. So did you want to add something?
I mean, look, I'm from Louisiana. I mean, I tell sometimes I'm from the country of Louisiana, right? I mean, that whole Gulf South is, I mean, you really equate it as like an emerging market, right? And so different cultures, different attitudes, different personalities. I've brought student teams from Hopkins, where I went to grad school, down to New Orleans, and for them, it was a huge culture shock, right? I mean, just as much as a culture shock could, it would be if you were to take that person to Colombia, right? So even, taking advantage of, and I think there are programs that are beginning to come up in which, whether it's AmeriCorps, of course, AmeriCorps been there for at least a decade, but, there are programs where now students are organizing, field trips or engagements, with cities, spending a week during spring break in, let's say, New Orleans, or spending a week, in another part of the country, doing a variety of different things. I mean, also the advantages, if you go to a place like Texas or California, there's a large number of international folks that live in those markets too.
So I think to add one more thing to that, I came to GW and I did my degree at GW because of the opportunities that GW presented. And I leveraged as many as I possibly could. And I slept very little. But the geopolitical aspects of Washington, D.C. are astounding. But that being said, I did my undergrad at Indiana University. And the Kelley School of Business is phenomenal for marketing. And so sometimes we stay in one spot. And while GW was amazing geopolitically, like for the politics and the business aspect that I was looking for, the strength at Indiana University was stronger for marketing. And so doing study abroad or study a state would be really helpful in terms of leveraging those different universities, the different places people could go to really deepen their understanding by the expertise of another school.
And your last question about the programs.
Sorry, I didn't mean to ask too many
that's
questions.
Okay. That's okay. And I'll just answer this, and then
we'll
take another
during
question.
During it, I was leaping through this. This is a fantastic book. I'm definitely going to share it with my students
Thank
as
you.
well.
That's great. That is
yes. Great. I know a lot of students are first going to the study abroad office and looking at the programs offered, for example, by GW, but there are a host of programs offered by other institutions. Yeah. And just what are your thoughts on that? What are how are students approaching it? And any thoughts?
I'll actually give a short, because I've done a lot of research in this space, and I don't speak for any university, so it allows me to actually say something that's, well, hopefully I'll be. Well, you tell me how it comes across. But there are a lot of problems with study abroad programs on campuses across the country. A lot of times there's a financial difference. Sometimes they're restrictive. When students walk in there, it's not, what are you studying and how would you like to make this work? It's, where do you want to go? I went to Italy. I mean, it's really, really different. And I've never walked into this study abroad office, so I don't know. But that's a real problem that has to change in order to actually help students make the most of it. I think cost is an issue. Sometimes students pay a lot of money, and I know there are financial models. So whether you're staying here, you pay the same amount of tuition if you're going somewhere else on the campus. program that actually affects some students. But actually, in the credit transfer. So a lot of times students are held hostage. If they go to another program and they directly enroll in a program in Peru, sorry, you can't transfer those credits. You know, and I've heard stories, students actually sobbing to me about this. You know, these things have happened to them. So I think it's really important that students do their research. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons that we put the book together, because you really have to figure out what it is that's going to work for you. But I also think that colleges and universities really have to become much more flexible. If we want to reach these goals of doubling the numbers, you know, and really getting more students to go, you've got to figure out a way to help more students go to places that they want to go to that are enriching for them and matter to them for whatever reasons, whether it's cost or, you know, their own cultural aspect or their own desires. So I think that's really important. Okay.
Let me just add slightly more positively, I think there are a lot of great opportunities that are run by universities, that are run by third-party providers, consortia of universities and overseas programs, and there are also great opportunities for students to intern and to make their own plans on their own. A lot of universities, colleges and universities do a great job of making that happen, and you're absolutely right, Stacie, that others make it more challenging. Some students don't help when they come after they come back and then want their credits transferred, or they come a day or two before they're going to leave and want to make sure that this is going to work. So some of the burden has to be on the students to go through and make sure it's going to work for them. But also, if they don't need the credit, sometimes students just want the experience and don't need the credit, and sometimes that can work for them too.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Do you have another question? So, do you have another question?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay, thank you. I'm a student from GW School Business.
Put the mic down so you, there you go. Oh. Whoops. Or hold it.
Okay. My name is Ray, and thank you for your great discussion. I am an international student from China, so I'm already studying abroad, and this fall I will exchange to Paris. So you mentioned a lot about the benefit of studying abroad for U.S. students. They are more competitive in the job market. So what do you think of international students in U.S. market? Do you think they're more competitive? According to my own experience, now I'm looking for some internship opportunities in America. I found it's really hard for international students, and opportunities is really very limited. Could you give me some suggestions?
Sure. I think there are so many. Chris mentioned the number of students, just Chinese students, right, like yourself, but it's almost 800,000. And so when you graduate, and I meet so many like you who actually want to work here, there's a cap on the number of visas that the U.S. government will give. That in and of itself is very competitive. And many students don't want to hear this, but what I say is think differently. Vineet was talking about making the connection maybe with Latin America. There's so many places throughout the African continent that skills are needed. And you have what's considered, the best education in the world, a degree from an American university. And I think you can really play that. But I think differentiating yourself with language skills and cultural is important. Looking at employers who actually have connections within China, but always be prepared that they may send you back and you may be a local hire. So you have to figure out the strategy of what makes you different from those other 300,000.
This is a sensitive issue because Chinese students, frankly, are caught between a rock and a hard place because it's difficult to get an H-1B, right? But the unemployment rate in China is increasing as well for the college-educated mass, and unless you have connections with SOEs, state-owned enterprises, it's quite difficult, right? What I suggest and tell Chinese students, because I work with them as sort of my other responsibilities, and I have sort of an interest, is I think it's critically important for Chinese students to set the expectation and to really debunk a lot of assumptions that American employers have of Chinese students, right? And so most Chinese students often have this perception that I need to work at Goldman Sachs, otherwise if I don't work at Goldman Sachs, it's a failure. Right? I need to work at that name brand. I need to work at Morgan Stanley if you're a finance student, at Goldman, otherwise it's like life is over. I think what's critically important is understanding what American employer assumptions are of Chinese students, and typically what do they say? And you know this. They sometimes say, withholding sort of the culture and language. You know, a lot of Chinese students are not team players, right? A lot of Chinese students don't take initiative. Part of that has to do everything to do with culture, right? Because in China, you know, sometimes it's somewhat frowned upon to be a little bit ambitious. But what I would suggest is, if you've just started your schooling here in the U.S., is start to build up a portfolio of experiences from a variety of firms, whether it's nonprofit, whether it's for-profit, that will help to build up specific skill sets, like a Lego block, right? Like Legos, where you start to build up specific skills so that at the end of the day, when they see a composite picture of your resume, what they're seeing is not someone that worked at ICBC Bank in China, and then that's it, and they just spent all day studying. What they want to see is someone that said, okay, I spent time in studying, I did well in grades, but then I also started student-led organizations. I learned teamwork skills. I went on, I went on a study abroad, right? Mm-hmm. Which many Chinese students that do come here, they don't jump to another country. So all those things will show to that employer that yes, it is you are an international student, you are from China, but let's give and pay a little bit more attention as they differentiate your application versus your peers that are applying for that same position. From my perspective, when we see applications from Chinese students, and we do, we don't necessarily compare them to an American student that's been here for 20, 30, 40 years, because I think that's a little bit, that's apples and oranges. What we do is we compare that student to their peer group and understand how much they've stretched themselves professionally and personally to differentiate, that one application. I mean, does that make sense?
So I think to add on to that, it seems like there are two aspects of your question. The first one was, how do you leverage your study abroad experience in order to make yourself more attractive on your resume? And the second one is looking towards internships and how to really build your opportunities to get internships. And I really like what Vineet was saying with this and what the panel's extending. And I think with the first one, really leverage that study abroad when you're going overseas, to think about how you're going to develop yourself in a more well-rounded way. So when you come back, you have an experience that you can put on the ground and say, I did this I wasn't just in Paris, but this is what I was doing in Paris. But secondly, and more importantly, when you're coming back and you're looking for these internship experiences, learn how to play the game in the United States. We've talked a lot about going other places and really learning how to live in another environment, but we forget often that the U.S. is a foreign country to a lot of people. And think about it in Washington, D.C., for example. If you're looking for an internship here, one opening gets 900 resumes. You're a numbers game if all you're doing is applying online. And in the United States, it's incredibly important to build networks, to show people and prove to people that you can work. And only when people see your work ethic and they understand who you are and they know you on a personal context and a professional context, do they start to open their network and open doors for you. And that's really important in this city. If you want to get a job, that's how you get it. My position at Booz Allen was opened not through any application, but through a phone call that was because of the network. Mm-hmm. I've had other job opportunities where people have reached out to me to help them or join their firm because of a network, but not at all because of my resume being shot through an online portal. Right. So keep that in mind. That is how it works here. So in China, you're worried about ranking. You're worried that the top 10 people that are coming out of a class or coming out of a school will get a job, right? It's all about numbers in China. Here, it's truly about building a network. And so keep that in mind when you're coming back or when you're in France and when you're in Paris. Keep that network alive while you're here because it quickly dies. So build yourself in Paris, but also come back with a network that you have already developed in the United States.
Thank you. Yeah. I'm going to take maybe one more question. Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Kevin Connell. I'm a sophomore here at the business school. I have not studied abroad yet. I'm thinking about studying abroad. I'm actually currently leaning towards study abroad, but one of my biggest concerns, I'm hoping maybe some of you can put that concern at ease for me, is that junior year, my next year, is often considered very critical in developing professionally, as in getting an internship like in the summer between junior, senior year, because often if you perform well, you're offered a position when you graduate. So while I would like to study abroad really badly, at the back of my mind I'm always thinking, well, what's the trade-off?
Ben, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, this is my exact situation. So my advice would be study abroad in the fall, and that kind of negated everything for me, because you come back and recruiting for the spring, or recruiting for the summer for an internship really only starts in the spring. There really isn't fall recruiting for internships. It's mostly for full-time jobs. So it's actually really good to go abroad in the fall, come back, you start applying. Definitely don't forget about the process. Start applying for places in the fall, and you'll start to hear back around January or February, and then interviews will start to come through. And it's really great to have it to interview and then to say, oh, I just got back from abroad and I just had these experiences, and I'm fresh. My language skills are fresh. You know, all of this all happened to me. I had a great teacher. I interacted with a business there that's similar to yours, and like they love to hear that. People love to hear that you went away and that you're relating it to their company.
And how about how you integrated it within the whole business curriculum, because you're a business
Oh
student.
yeah, I mean, if you do decide to go abroad, I'm not sure what the deadlines are for the GW Paris program, but
Those have passed.
oh.
Yeah.
Right, sorry.
I'm looking at Ireland.
Yeah, but there are many programs that are business programs that aren't through GW that you can definitely still get into, that are very beneficial, and that you can take classes and have teachers and have experiences in that you won't have if you stay here. So I would 100% advocate for it. If you go abroad, if you do decide to go abroad in the spring, it's not the end of the world by any means, because you're still applying to places, and places understand that if you're abroad. And I know 5 or 6 of my friends were abroad last spring, and they all had Skype interviews, or a couple places flew them back. So it's really not the end of the world. That should not be one of the reasons that you shouldn't go abroad, definitely.
Great.
And
we'll get,
I would also, again, advocate for short-term programs. If you feel like this is very critical and you don't want to go for the entire semester, and you make the critical decision that you are going to stay for the fall and not go in the spring, or whatever decision you make, you should also look up fall short-term study abroad programs that are faculty-led, because like our colleagues said, they're very saturated with information, with speakers, with connections and networks that you can build in a very short time, that if you nurture them the right way, those could turn into job opportunities and or internships abroad for the following summer. So you may not even be in the DC pool of 900 applicants to one application.
And you can intern in the summer too. You can do, you don't have to study, if it works better for your schedule, to maybe do some kind of an internship or volunteer or something like that over the summer. That also is a good opportunity. Okay, so we've actually gone past our time, but thank you all for being a great audience. And we'll all mill around here too if you want to come up and ask anybody any questions. But good luck, and thank you very much. Thank you.